for a house that was large enough for our children and have privacy for ourselves, and we like to entertain. And we first thought of moving back to Squirrel Hill, where our parents lived. But the cost of land at that time and the taxes were beyond our means. So we could have an older traditional house. In fact, we began looking at those houses. But it felt like we were moving back in time and that we were at a point of wanting to continue to be in the spirit of the 60s. Not only that, every time we looked at a house, it felt constricted. The interior was, half of the interior wasn't used. You'd walk into a house and you'd have a formal living room and dining room that nobody used except for a special occasion. Everybody was either sitting in a little small family room or in a kitchen nook, and it felt like a terrible waste of space. But also, in the late 1950s, my husband and I made a trip to New York, and we took a plane, and we saw the TWA building with Saarinen as the architect. And I remember my sense of awe as I entered that building and saw the flow and the sense of space. And it was the first time I was aware of the beauty of contemporary architecture. So as we were looking at houses in the traditional neighborhood and the traditional but lovely house I grew up in, there was a sense of not moving forward. We also asked some architects that my family knew to design a house. And when we looked at the designs, they still felt like another version of the same old thing. And then we heard about, there was a house in our neighborhood, a small house, but a house I'd walk by pushing my little ones in a stroller. And it was a very different kind of house. It had a brick courtyard around it. It had flat roof with overhangs, and it was kind of a secret house. You always wondered what was inside. And then finally, when we turned down the last drawings of an architect, I said, can't we have a house designed like, and I had learned the architect was Peter Berenstain. And the person said, well, why don't you call Peter Berenstain? And we thought, we could never afford Peter Berenstain. But we did call, and we told him that we had still very modest means. And he took us to a house that had just been finished. And it was of 8-inch square concrete block, and it was semicircular, and it also, the circular exterior, within it was a circular fountain. And we drove by, and the couple that had built the house were putting in little cobblestones in their driveway area, and we were just driving by, and we said, we heard about your house. And they said, why don't you come in? But they were a little embarrassed. It was Sunday morning, and, the house was not cleaned up, and they had obviously had a great night there the night before. But that was what made the house so appealing, we walked in spite of the, quote, mess, unquote, it was stunning. The sense of space, the beauty of the courtyard, the sense of proportion. It was the same sense of space that I remembered from the Saarinen House, TWA building. And we both, my husband and I, looked at each other and said, how could we not live in a house that wasn't designed by someone like this? So we called Peter again, and he came to meet us. And he spent several hours with us, and he met our 4 very little children. They were, I think, 2, 4, 6, and 8 at the time. He asked us how we liked to live, what we wanted, and he thanked us, and he disappeared. And he said he'd come back with some drawings. Well, it was 7 months, 8 months. Finally, 9 months, just the same amount of time it takes to produce a baby, Peter came with his drawings, and they were breathtaking. They were beautiful. And we looked at them, and the only thing we could think of even changing was changing one bathtub to a stall shower. But it took advantage of the view of the city. It took advantage of the hillside. It acknowledged our belief that public space should be used frequently. So there was a beautiful large living room and dining room and balcony that looked over the city. And the study, the den, was only big enough for 2 people. So we couldn't all crowd and use it as a substitute to a living space. And the children, the girls had their room and the boys had their room, and everything was built in, including the dining room table, which he designed. And we had a courtyard with a concrete block wall around it, and a fountain or a little pond. And the house faced the back. It faced the city, where every other house on our street faced the street. So they looked at each other, and we looked out on the city, and we could see, and we had these beautiful windows, 8 that was built on a 4-foot module. So the beams met the windows, and of course all the windows had to be constructed because they weren't standard size. And we had a beautiful, huge fireplace so that we could gather. And on the bottom level, we also had a fireplace. And in the bottom room under the living room, there was a place for a piano so our children who took piano lessons could play. So we had privacy. We had a guest room downstairs, but with French doors looking out on the back. And, well, it just had everything we wanted. And it had a beautiful breakfast room that looked out on the courtyard. And we had a galley kitchen so that when we had our informal family meals, we weren't looking at a stove full of pots. We were looking out on the courtyard garden. It was a simple house, made with cemestos board and concrete block, and wooden strips, beautiful wooden strips and wooden beams. And of course, the glass went into the concrete block. So there was a flow of materials, and the indoors and the outdoors met. And when it rained, we could see the water rippling. We had gravel on the roof, and the water would be reflected on the roof above. I think there wasn't a day, I lived in that house for 37 years, I don't think there was a day that we didn't discover some new beauty in the living in that house, the privilege of living in the house. And I worked for 17 years with the school system, and we brought children in, students in to see the house, especially vocational students who were in carpentry classes. But we brought in students, inner city students, to see their city in a new way. And the beauty of the house was also the sunsets, because the house faced the west. But it also faced the downtown triangle of Pittsburgh, where we had the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Building and the U.S. Steel Building. And when the sun from the east rose and shone on the downtown triangle with those buildings, on a day where the sun would shine, we'd even see the sunset reflected back through the windows that we later would see the sunrise reflected back on the same windows that we could admire the setting sun. And the most beautiful thing that Peter designed was our front door, which was an extra wide Dutch door. So when people would ring the bell, we could open the top, and we could see them, but they could also open and look through the house to the city beyond through the windows. And I remember the first Halloween, when many of the children those were the days in 1965 where children could still walk the streets safely in Halloween. So we had children from our immediate neighborhood, and we had children from the projects that came for their tricks or treats. And I remember one boy from the projects, as we opened the top of the Dutch door and he could look at the lights of the city beyond, and he said, "Wow, this is a mansion. No, this is a castle." And then his eyes widened even more, and he said, "This is a ranch." And that was the wonder that he experienced, and the wonder that we as a family experienced every day we lived in that wonderful house. And when the Landmark Society decided that we and another group of Peter's people who lived in Peter's houses, either those who were the first owners or even the second owners, created an effort to have his architecture recognized. There were tours of 3 of his houses, and public television had a feature, and then the University of Pittsburgh Frick Museum had a exhibit of his work. And people would move through our house, a busload of people, admiring this sense of space, the indoor and the outdoor. There was no division between the two as my lovely home I grew up in as a child. This was a home that brought in the outdoors and let out the indoors. And that was my experience.